Andrew, if you'd like to make your way to the stage. Andrew's going to be talking about the beast of Bodmas, which I won't mention the equation, because, you know, we don't like equations, do we? We do like equations.
I mean, there were a lot of equations and a dated reference to Liz Truss in the last talk, so this is going to go really, really well.
Andrew Taylor, well.
All right. So before I go on to the next slide, please work out the answer to this. I'm not going to ask you, just it'll land better if you do. So this is a viral math problem that I nicked from Twitter, who in turn nicked it from a YouTube video about the answer to this viral math problem that they had nicked from Twitter. It's done a few laps of the internet, is what I'm saying, and the reason is because it causes arguments, right? So if you worked it out, you probably got either 9 or 1. And the other answer looks as ridiculous as if I held up a blue and black dress and swore blind it was white and gold. Right? That is how this works. So, you know, you just have a big argument on your aunt's Facebook wall, and then somebody has a bright idea of putting it into a calculator. Calculators disagree about the answer to this question. So, which of these calculators is broken becomes the question. Now, you probably know this is really a question about the order of operations, right, if you've seen this before. So you do the addition first, and then if you do the division next, you get 3 3s are 9. If you do the multiplication next, you get 6 over 6 is 1. And those are the two answers. So which is right? Well, in school, most of us, I think, taught Bodmas, or if you're an American, PEMDAS. And this is the order in which you do the operations. And you can see straight away that they disagree about multiplication and division, right? But that is not the problem. Because actually this says division and multiplication is one thing. You do it all at once, which is to say you ignore which one is which and just go left to right. The division's on the left, so you do it first. Most maths teachers, from my unscientific observation of people arguing about this on the internet, say the answer is 9. Bodmas says the answer is 9. The YouTube video I mentioned earlier says the answer is 9. The answer is 9. End of talk. Thank you. Any questions? Except... equally unscientifically, I believe most mathematicians would get the answer 1. Because if you look at maths textbooks, all of them, like the bottom left there, 2ab over 2a equals b, the only way that's true is if the a is part of the division, right? So that means you do the division last after all the multiplications, which is not what Bodmas says. So are we just teaching kids a rule that doesn't exist? Is that what we're doing? Because it wouldn't be the first time. A panda walks into a restaurant, bear with me, orders a plate of bamboo. When it's finished its meal, it pulls out a gun, kills a waiter, and walks out. And everyone's like, what the hell? I thought pandas were nice, the Scottish lied to me, etc. But if they'd done their research, they would know that the giant panda eats, shoots, and leaves. And I should remember to edit this page back. It's funny because there's a comma. That is not my joke, all right? So... this book is actually not all that strident if you sit down and read the thing, but it's sort of become culturally the Mein Kampf of grammar Nazis. It's really weird. And by grammar Nazis, I mean prescriptivists. So a descriptivist linguist is one like a scientist who wants to look at the world and see how language is used and write it down and infer how it works and do like science, do little experiments. It's really interesting. A prescriptivist linguist views the English language as a Platonic ideal from which thou shalt not deviate. And they are not interested in observing how people actually use the language, because as far as they're concerned, we use it wrong. Lee. And that's wrong on its face, but the more interesting reason that these people are wrong is that their logic is like saying that if you know Newton's laws of physics, Newton's laws of motions, you can catch a ball. Which is like, have you played sports with a scientist? It's not true. Let me show you what I mean, right? The core assumption here is that the linguist speaks correctly, right? Because this whole thing is just snobbery. So, right, you assume you speak correctly. Therefore, you know all the laws of grammar, right? Therefore, if you teach other people the laws of grammar, they will speak correctly. Society will improve because snobbery. That's the logic, and it doesn't work, right? Because you can know the laws of grammar in the conscious part of your brain, but the bit of your brain that generates sentences isn't like referencing that, it's just doing its own thing and obeying the actual laws that exist. So these people write a bunch of books saying you shouldn't split infinitives, but because that rule isn't real, they write them with a bunch of split infinitives in them. And they don't go back and check because they assume that they speak correctly. That's the whole point. And their editors aren't checking it either because they're professionals and they don't care if you split an infinitive because it's not actually wrong. So, back to Bodmas. Yeah, Bodmas kind of works the same way. All of these textbooks I picked because I borrowed these from a YouTube video, which is in the sources at the end. They all have a passage at the front that says, all multiplications and divisions in order from left to right. And that's not what they do. This one as well. It's not what they do. All multiplications and divisions proceeding from left to right, it's not what they do. So what's happening here? They all believe that Bodmas is a complete description of mathematical notation because that's what they were taught. And they all know how to do mathematical notation. It's just the two don't match up quite. Bodmas isn't wrong per se, it's just not really useful in this context. Because this isn't mathematical notation, not really. That is what you write if you're a mathematician, isn't it? The only time you'd ever put it on one line is if you were doing a text message or something where you can't do equation formatting. I assume we're all texting equations to each other. How else do you communicate clearly? So what you do is you just sort of fudge it. You move the bits around and put it on. That's all that is. And you end up with this kind of nice system of notation where I think the thing on the right is kind of fairly clearly the same as the thing on the left in every case. It's fairly clear where it comes from. Whereas if you do the strict Bodmas version and put all the extra brackets in, you get this, which I think is a bit of a mess. I don't know. It's not terrible, but a good advantage of the way we actually do it is that you don't need any brackets at all. You can just write all of these with one slash and no brackets. And yeah, okay, so reducing brackets isn't the whole point of good maths notation, but equally, if you don't mind brackets at all, why bother with Bodmas? Why not just write them all in, save yourself an argument on the internet? So this is not a maths problem, is what I'm saying. This is a notation problem. And really, it's about context. So when I said this was like the dress, I really meant it. The dress takes colour, which only makes sense in context, presents it without the context. Your brain invents some context and reaches an interpretation. Someone else's brain invents a different context, reaches a different interpretation. Neither is wrong. Well, I mean, the dress is actually, we've seen it, but if you look at this and take it to be a line from a maths textbook, then the answer is 1. If you take it to be a line from a children's maths exercise sheet, the answer is 9. What's happening here is that this is designed to cause arguments, and rather than think about it for 10 seconds, we all just decide we'd much rather have a big fight. It kind of bothers me because it feels like it's kind of patronizing. But this is what you all look like when you use facts and logic to argue about what the correct answer is to that equation. And I guess my point for talking about this nonsense for so long is that I believe, as skeptics, it is our duty not to find the correct answer necessarily to these questions. I think we should have a more nuanced take to this situation than to stand between the two opposing armies and say, guys, my teacher said it was a duck. All right, that's all I've got. I've thrown in a little topology joke for any mathematicians in there.
Right. So ego is always the first question, apparently. In Polish notation, superior to all other notations, of course we all know that, and will save us from Lorry-Yanni will they save us from Lorry-Yanni problems in the future?
Yes, it will, in the sense that, so Polish notation it's not something I particularly use. It's commonly used by calculators, because calculators and programming languages do need this stuff to be absolutely unambiguous. Programming languages have strict rules built into them about how you do this, and they don't run into this problem because they don't actually let you write multiplication that way. So yeah, calculators, programming languages, stuff like that, they all have a solution that makes this unambiguous. The only thing is, it's a clunky way to write mathematics, just day to day. the unambiguous ways tend to be quite verbose, like the version with all the brackets in, or else just not how we talk. It's like different date formats. The ISO date format is like the best, technically, in a lot of ways, but you won't convince people to use it. So, yeah, that sort of thing does work, but it probably won't take off as like a day-to-day solution.
Although I fully support people talking in ISO date format. I think that's a great idea. Let's get on that after this. Next question. Are you surprised the book is controversial with a name like Truss? Getting very political at this time in the morning.
Yeah, a lot of my practice for this book was remembering to say, for this talk was remembering to say Lynn Truss instead of Liz Truss, and eventually I just dropped the reference altogether and didn't mention her by name. It was just easier. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they're related, but you never know.
And from Bremner, is Bremner in here? Thanks for making me read out equations. Isn't mx just implicit brackets of bracket m star x bracket?
Yeah, so a common way of getting around this is there is... some Americans use PEJMDAS as their acronym, which I think at that point, the acronym is not helping you. But the J stands for juxtaposition, which, again, is not a good thing to... Like, kids don't know what that means, right? So, yeah, PEJMDAS says that multiplication by juxtaposition, which is when you just write the two numbers next to each other, that has precedence over division and multiplication by symbols. And yeah, that does resolve it, but I think it's a slightly unhelpful approach in the sense that actually in maths you just don't write any other sort of multiplication unless you're dealing with vectors or something, and then it's usually unambiguous anyway because there's only one valid order to do it in. So yeah, that is another common solution, PEJMDAS, or I've never heard of Bodmas. That doesn't seem to have taken off in the same way. Yeah, you can do that, and that kind of solves it, but it just isn't what people do. So so far, it hasn't stopped people arguing about it on the internet.
Question from Aaron. I remember learning in American school to multiply before divide. Do you know if there's much cultural variation in how the order of operations is taught?
I do not. So you would think that mathematical notation would be international, and it kind of isn't. So you know when you write like 1.5 as 1 and then a 1/2? In a lot of Europe, I think that just doesn't exist, and they would read that as 1 multiplied by a half. So yeah, mathematical notation is culturally variant, and I haven't heard of one where people put the multiplication before division always, but that is mostly because I haven't looked for one.
And the last question we have is, does implied multiplication have a higher priority than explicit multiplication and division, making the answer 1?
Yeah, that's essentially the PEJMDAS one again, but rephrased, I suppose. Yes, that is like a fairly normal way of reading it, and part of the issue with this comes from the equation uses the division symbol, which makes people think, this is like, children's maths exercise sheets, because that's the only place you ever see the division symbol, except on a calculator, where you need some symbol for it. But it also uses the implicit multiplication, which only really appears in maths textbooks, which makes people think that you read it like a maths text. I think, really, these two things never meet in nature. So, yeah, if they have a precedence, implied multiplication is higher, but I'm not sure that's a meaningful way. It's subjective, I think.
Andrew Taylor, everyone.